Why hello there, and welcome back to the Nat Cave. And as we continue our celebration of the spooky month of October, inching towards Halloween, I wanted to celebrate another dark and brooding masterpiece of 90s cinema, Blade. Now, in order to truly appreciate Blade, we need to cast our minds back to a time before the MCU, before The Dark Knight, even before Bryan Singer's X-Men. This movie was released a full 10 years before Iron Man was. And whereas some of those movies have been credited with beginning the era of more serious comic book movies, I would argue that it all began with Blade. Now, for a further bit of perspective, in the UK at this time, DVD was an almost brand new technology, and the first DVD I ever bought was Blade. I won't reveal whether or not I actually watched it at the time, as I wasn't even 10 years old yet. But in the same way that we had a changing of the guard of physical media, and VHS was standing down after 25 years of dominating the living room, Blade, to me, represents a kind of paradigm shift in the world of superhero movies as well, and how a lot of other media was moving into this darker, more broody era. Comic book movies were going that way as well. The era was ushered in by Blade. I'm just telling my personal story and what the film means to me. And if you think I'm wrong, I would be delighted to hear why in the comments. So Blade is set in a real world but vampire-ridden Los Angeles. It's never explicitly stated, I don't think, where the film is taking place, but a lot of it was shot in LA, and it does feel like LA as well. And who or what is Blade? Well, Blade is a badass hybrid that has all the strengths of vampires and almost none of their weaknesses, except for the fact that he ages like a human and he has the thirst for human blood. He's able to abate the symptoms of this thirst with his serum. And basically how this happened is his mother was bitten by a vampire when she was pregnant, and thus only part of the vampire mutation was transferred to him, giving him the strengths without weaknesses. So Blade could enjoy a big old bowl of spaghetti aglio e olio with no problems, and he can sunbathe for as long as he wants. What this means in terms of the viewer's experience is that we have a hero in this movie that is stronger and more able than pretty much every adversary he faces. It's always a bit of a cop-out when a superhero movie weakens the hero so as to create the challenge that way. I want to see the hero at their strongest and meeting a challenge that is equal to them and them emerging victorious. You just think about how satisfying it was for Batman to face the Joker in The Dark Knight when Batman was full strength. What an epic clash. And it was so much more satisfying than seeing Batman get his ass beat by Bane in The Dark Knight Rises, as by the end of that film it becomes totally clear that Dark Knight Batman would have destroyed Bane in that initial fight. So if Batman was at his peak, The Dark Knight Rises wouldn't have been a challenge for him. In Blade, we get a hero at peak power, which is really, really satisfying. And ultimately, Blade just ends up being a phenomenal character. But having a phenomenal character on paper is one thing. You have to have a phenomenal person to portray that character. Enter Wesley Snipes. Now, throughout the 90s, Wesley Snipes was the man. When I think of Wesley Snipes in the 90s, I'm thinking of Passenger 57, US Marshals, Demolition Man, The Fan, all great movies and great parts. But for me, he will always be defined by his turn as the Daywalker. And just as I feel it's easy to take Blade the movie for granted now, it is easy to take Wesley Snipes as Blade for granted as well, as it is such a masterful embodiment and portrayal of the character. He embodied the physicality of Blade by getting in spectacular physical shape and condition, and Wesley Snipes was a legitimately badass martial artist as well. But just to get some perspective on how great of a performance Wesley Snipes gives in this, I recommend taking some time out to watch other portrayals of the character. The one that sticks out for me is his turn in Spider-Man the Animated Series from the mid-90s, which, incidentally, in my opinion, is the greatest Marvel animated show that has ever existed. It's fantastic. And having Blade turn up to face Michael Morbius was such a treat. And it's an awesome rendition of the character, but it just shows you that the source material leaves quite a wide range of potential possibilities, not just the one that Wesley Snipes did. But Blade's turn in Spider-Man is also very important because it's where the character of Abraham Whistler was debuted. Not in the comics. Whistler was created for this animated show, and Marvel loved it so much that they retconned Whistler into the Blade canon, and we see him appear in this movie. There is no Blade without Whistler. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this video on Blade now is that I wanted to pay tribute to the man that portrayed Whistler, the great Kris Kristofferson. Country music legend, fantastic actor, and his performance in this movie, his portrayal of Whistler, is just pitch perfect. And I gotta just shout out the casting directors, Rachel Abrams and Jory Weitz. I don't know where the idea to cast Kris Kristofferson came from, but it was inspired. Now, Kris Kristofferson was a rare commodity in that he was actually a principled human being, a self-proclaimed dove with claws. He was a US Army captain that flew helicopters in Vietnam, but subsequently became very involved in the anti-war movement. And this was all whilst existing in the quite jingoistic world of country music. And without going into any more detail than that, he was a very, very tough man. Very tough. He stood for what he thought was right, and he acted on it, even at great personal cost. And for me, this is the essence of what makes a great person. And Kris Kristofferson was a great person. The thing is, in terms of the movie, having a person of this caliber and this character and this toughness portraying Whistler is crucial. And I think it's one of the largest aces that Blade has up its sleeve. As with Wesley being Blade, Kris Kristofferson is Whistler. He just is Whistler. And whereas Malcolm McDowell's portrayal of Whistler and Spider-Man, also fantastic, was a little bit more formal, maybe a little bit colder, whereas Kris Kristofferson's Whistler is more rugged, more tough, and warmer as well, and personable. And it's probably due to the fact that that's what he was like in real life. For there to be a kind of mentor, father-like character to Blade, that person has to be very, very tough, very strong. For somebody like Blade to have any respect for him, and for us as an audience to believe that relationship, the person playing Whistler had to be a tough SOB. Now, as well as having Blade and Whistler, Aine Boucher-Wright is also wonderful in this film. I haven't actually ever seen her in anything else, so I always just associate her with Blade, but she grounds the film amazingly well. And the journey that her character of Karen goes on, transitioning from this world of blissful ignorance, working as a hematologist in the hospital, going down into the real world with the vampires, it keeps the whole film feeling kind of gritty and grounded, rather than kind of descending into the fantastical. It's one of the best aspects of Blade, in my opinion. I also really love Stephen Dorff as Deacon Frost. Afterwards, he kind of disappeared for me after this movie. I didn't really see him in anything until I saw his name in the credits for Public Enemies, which is a film I wasn't particularly fond of with Johnny Depp and Christian Bale. But I could never figure out where he was in the film. I could never see him. And then he had a turn in season 3 of True Detective, which I thought was like a super solid season. It wasn't a patch on season 1, but Dorff was really good, and he actually had a phenomenally well executed accent in the show. Now, like a lot of media at the time, Blade casts a very dark mood in terms of its visual design, music, everything. But unlike today, where that sponge has almost been wrung dry, especially in the comic book space, Blade felt completely new. Great comic book movies had already existed before Blade came out in 1998. We had Tim Burton's Batman come out in '89, which I love that movie. But Batman still had a very fantastical feel about it. And whilst it was obviously more gritty and dark than Adam West Turner's Batman, which I also really enjoy, it was not doing what Blade was doing, which was a full-blooded, R-rated, violent romp of comic book action. And that's something that's still greenlit with hesitancy today. We've got Deadpool, we've got Joker, but an R-rated comic book movie is not a common thing today. When it comes to the film itself, the way the film has been photographed has always been extremely appealing to me. I mean, the opening to this movie is just the stuff of legend. If you were there in the 90s at the time, the intro with the Blood Rave, pump panel reconstruction mix of Confusion by New Order. Back in the day when this came out, the soundtrack was so legendary, and there were so many 90s bangers on there, like dance tune bangers, that my girlfriend actually went and pre-ordered the soundtrack on CD from W.H. Smith. The whole sequence at the beginning of this movie is magnificent. And one of the most emotionally impactful things about it is we go from this feeling of profound vulnerability on behalf of the poor dude that's been lured into the rave, and he was just completely terrified, and then suddenly this looming figure appears and all the vampires kind of cower away. We really get a sense of just how powerful Blade is just from this one moment. What an unbelievable introduction for a character that is. And the action that follows is just a grade A demonstration of great, competent filmmaking. All the vampires are drenched in blood, and this contrasts wonderfully against Blade's black armor and jacket. And this makes it very easy to keep track of what's going on with the action. It's not something you think about when you're watching it. What happens is you just enjoy what you're seeing more. The CGI when the vampires get killed and they disintegrate still looks really passable today. It's done very tastefully. It doesn't distract you. It doesn't take you out of the action like some old CGI does it, but even more modern CGI does that. This is just quality work. And this is all without talking about the actual action itself, which is fantastic. And we've got Wesley Snipes actually doing a lot of the stunt work here and a lot of the fighting, a lot of the kicks and stuff. And it feels great to watch, which is the key. This opening sequence is also a fantastic place to start talking about the music as well. We've got a really interesting kind of duality to the music in this film, where we've got a score composed by Mark Isham, which I cannot say enough good things about the work that Mark did in this movie. It's phenomenal and very ahead of its time as well. But this is contrasted with some very strong, pounding 90s dance beats. And the contrast between the two is emblematic of the mood changes of the film itself. Now, when the film begins, it starts with Mark's dark score. And the musical score is a combination of orchestral instruments and electronic instruments as well. A sound that would basically become very much like something we've heard a lot. But obviously in 1998, this was a much fresher sound. It's just wonderful, wonderful work. But as we're hearing this, and the film is starting, they're moving towards the blood rave. As soon as they get into the blood rave, we get the pump panel reconstruction mix. And then when Blade appears, it transitions back to the dark score.
Blade, it's the Daywalker.
And then once the action begins, we're straight into Junkie XL's dealing with the roster.
My weapon of choice.
Dealing with the roster, Two-Face.
The main thing this does for us is it gives the film a very distinct personality and identity. It takes a creative risk. These two very contrasting musical styles, there's no guarantee that this would work, but it does, and it's phenomenal. In the same way that the music transitions between the sort of broody electronic orchestral music and the 90s dance bangers, the sound design and the visual design does the same thing. And the mood of the film changes as a result. And this might be the thing that defines Blade more than anything else for me. Mood. I don't know about you, but in films, I love space. I don't mean the cosmos, I mean emptiness. When a film has quietness, silence, it demonstrates great confidence on the part of those people making it, and it often has the consequence of increasing the emotional power of the sound, of the music, when it does hit. And some movies, it feels like those that are making it are sort of terrified of leaving any empty space, so they cram music into every nook and cranny, and the entirety of the film has music playing through it. And this doesn't make a movie bad if they do this. I love Mission Impossible Fallout. There is music playing all the way through that. I thought Oppenheimer was really good, and there is music playing through the entirety of that film as well. But when I think about the mood cast by Blade, it just hits different. It feels different. And when I consider my favorite sequences from the movie, my mind doesn't go to the blood rave. It doesn't go to the insanely awesome fight sequences. It goes to sequences like this. And this. And for a film that has so many action sequences with so much fast, frenetic energy, to have these calm, quiet, meditative, brooding sequences, it is beautiful. So much of this movie has no music over it.
How's the entrance?
I can't tell you that, man.
Stay with me, sweetness. Because I'm not finished with you yet.
Overall, the photography in this film is wonderful. There's a lot of creative techniques, like they undercrank a couple of scenes, and I can't help but appreciate the effort they went to get these newspapers blowing around. I really love the way that it deals with the reality of vampires existing. The film kind of depicts vampires as a biological phenomenon rather than a supernatural one or a magical one. Whistler makes the point of saying that vampire blood can't sustain hemoglobin, and thus they need to feed on human blood to maintain their hemoglobin levels or something. I don't really understand that, but it's a biological explanation for what's going on. Vampires are not allergic to crosses. Holy water doesn't do anything, but they're allergic to garlic because it triggers anaphylaxis in them. It's an allergic reaction, which is obviously a biological thing. Although when Karen hits Mercury with the vampire mace and her head blows up, I'm not sure that's anaphylactic shock. But this more science fiction than supernatural or fantasy fiction does get confused at the end when Frost summons La Magra and the skeleton angel ghost things all appear, which do seem to be magical or supernatural. But as well as giving us an explanation for the biology of vampires, the film also gives us some hints into the political realities of maintaining a secret vampire society. And this is where Frost's motivation comes from. You know, he's a younger, more ambitious, more hungry vampire, and thus falls out of favor with the more conservative establishment or the leaders of the vampire nation, who are more content to sort of survive and get by. You know, he believes that humans should be trying to survive in a vampire society, not the other way around. So he started organizing these large gatherings like the blood rave we saw at the beginning, which is allegedly in contravention of the agreement that the vampire nation has with the human politicians. And so he ends up earning the ire of the vampire establishment. And he's also castigated as not being, quote, a pure blood, because he was turned into a vampire rather than being born as one. And all of these things combined are what drive him to become La Magra and summon the blood god to try and trigger some sort of vampire apocalypse where vampires just take over the world. But to achieve this, he needs the blood of the Daywalker. And after we learn that Frost was the one that bit Blade's mother, we are forced to consider whether or not Frost bit her with the goal of creating a Daywalker whose blood he would then use in this ritual to become the blood god. The dramatic peak of the movie happens when Blade returns to his base after the base has been discovered by Frost, and he comes back and discovers Whistler's there and has been bitten and is not in good shape. In this part, the music, the acting, the visuals, the story, it all just comes together and it's magnificent. And it's emblematic of the quality that Blade brought to comic book movies and the seriousness with which the people making it treated the comic book source material. The final part of this film ends with us getting a really good look at the outstanding physical shape that Wesley got himself into for this movie, before we're treated to the 90s banger Playing with Fire from Expansion Union as Blade takes care of business. When he faces Frost as La Magra, it's the first time in the film that we do legit feel that Blade is confronted by something or someone more powerful than he is. And this is happening whilst Blade is back to full strength. So it's legit, it feels legit, and we feel vulnerable on Blade's behalf. But ultimately, science wins the day, and to put a cherry on top, Blade drops one of the best one-liners in comic book movie history.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
and it's the brawn of Blade plus the brains of Karen that lead to Frost being destroyed. Ultimately, again, making this fundamentally a science fiction film rather than a supernatural one, in my opinion. Even with the ghost skeleton angels. All in, this is simply a brilliant, entertaining, and beautiful movie. I have to give another shout out to the magisterial work of Mark Isham and the music that he created. It's just so good and so goddamn tasteful and pitch perfect for the mood that it was trying to set in this film. Everybody was on the same page when they were making Blade. Now, a quick word on the sequels to Blade. Whilst neither really come close to the class, the poise, the overall quality that the original had, they're both interesting and they are both worth watching in their own right, in my opinion. The problem is for me that they both suffer from the fact that they turn the dial too far in the direction of the fantastical and away from the gritty realism that the first film expressed so well. They both lack a character like Karen to maintain that sense of there being a human world and a vampire world, and they feel less grounded as a result. I respect getting a director as visionary as Guillermo del Toro to direct Blade 2, and there was a lot of insanely good visual design, creativity, but as a movie, it just doesn't quite come together for me in the way that Blade does. And as for Blade Trinity, when I watched it at the cinema as a 14-year-old teenager, I really enjoyed it. I had a great time. I think I went to see it again as well. And I do still enjoy it now, although the nostalgia-tinted spectacles are surely doing a lot of heavy lifting for this one. Bringing Dracula into the mix is insane and inspired, because it is kind of the ultimate bad guy that you can imagine Blade facing. As I mentioned, the silliness factor is just cranked so high that the tether with reality is basically completely severed. Thus, if you think of it as its own kind of vampire fantasy comic book movie, rather than a sequel to Blade, it has some entertainment value. If nothing else, we get to see Deadpool and Triple H have a wrestling match. And if that ain't worth watching, I don't know what is. I'm really glad that we've been able to take this time to go back and celebrate Blade, a film that has truly, in my humble opinion, aged like a beautiful wine. It's really, really easy to take Blade for granted today, but taking the time to appreciate it in its then contemporary context, for me, just really underscores how brilliant of a movie it is. And for those of us that are up to date with the most recent MCU movie, without spoiling anything, I think there might have been one moment in particular that made you smile as much as it made me smile. And that, my friends, is the sign of something truly timeless. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.